Hello and welcome to the showcase of my process for making black border chimp strategies for expert maps. I'll have this in the background while I verbally explain my process, and this is a guide that I hope to be able to release tomorrow if doable. At some points I'm probably going to explain what I'm doing in this run based on my process. But I'm not going to explain any difficult placements or micro, because the commentary with this guide will come out tomorrow. So usually how I get started with making my strategies is I choose what map I want to do, and then I figure out what tower I want to use as my main DPS. And once I figured out what tower I want to use for my main DPS, in this one it's Dark Champion, I pick what hero I think would work well as support for that tower. Here, because I couldn't think of any good heroes that work well with a Dark Champion, I just picked Geraldo because I figured he would also make the save up easier. And once I decide what tower I want to use as my main DPS, I then decide if, for late game, I want to get another cheap tier 5 to help out a bit, or if I want to just go for some basic support like a Moab glue, Moab presses, an overclock maybe, call to arms even sometimes. And usually if I get a second cheaper tier 5, it's going to be something like a Bloons solver, a Moab eliminator. Cheaper tier 5s like that that play a big role in ZOMG layer destruction or ceramic cleanup. And then once I've picked everything I want to use for the late game, I pick what I want to use for the mid game. Usually the options I think of are Spiked Mines, Comanche Defense for single lane maps, and Condor works for single lane and multi-lane maps. Works better on single lane, but multi-lane works well too, because it just turns it into a single lane. And then sometimes I get a bouncing bullet as well, like I do here. But that's only with Geraldo, because bouncing bullets are only really worth using in the mid-game with Geraldo. If I'm on Sanctuary, I consider a Bloon area denial system because it does significantly better on Sanctuary than on most other maps when you're trying to black border without much micro. Another mid-game that you've definitely seen me use a lot if you've watched most of my guides is an Elite Sniper and a MAME Moab, where you get the Elite Sniper before 63, and then usually with that I go for a cheaper but sometimes weaker tier 5, because Elite Sniper transitions incredibly into the mid game or into the late game as well. Ooh. Well, that was a lightning bolt. Yeah, I'm recording this in a thunderstorm, don't question it. As I was saying, Elite Sniper transitions very well into the late game and can pretty much be your main DPS tower. So, usually you want to get a tier 5 that covers its weaknesses, like Archmage. Archmage works pretty well with it from testing. And just other towers that can deal with DDTs pretty well and can deal with the ZOMG layer. And also, if you're getting Elite Sniper, you always get a MAME Moab as well, because Elite Sniper directly buffs MAME Moab, and MAME just covers Elite Sniper's weakness, which is spaced Moabs. Also, sometimes if a good mid-game tower, but it is very ability-based, is Summon Phoenix. It's still pretty good. I think it would work well on Muddy Puddles, and probably a few other maps similar to it. Oh yeah, pretty much everything I say in this probably won't work on the hardest maps. Those specific maps being Ouch, Bloody, Quad, and Ravine, because those maps are just so different from the other expert maps, to the point where, I wouldn't want to pretend like it works for every map. Especially Quad, because Quad's meta is so different from every other map's meta, to the point where, most strategies that work on other maps don't work on quad. But anyways, those are most of the mid-game towers. Sometimes if you're struggling with Moab damage, you can get like a Moab glue to assist you, which you'll probably get late game anyway, so sometimes it can work. And now that I've planned everything out pretty much in my process, I go to Challenge Editor and enable the least cash function, and using some pretty easy math, I can figure out how much money I have left to spend in a run, because before round 100 you make about $177,000 in a standard chimps game. And the least cash thing shows how much money you've spent, so just subtract the two and you'll figure out how much money you have left to spend. And there's a neat little website, which I'll add in the description, that has an income calculator that lets you figure out when you can get things if you just do a bit of math. And sometimes the CyberQuincy Discord bot also assists with figuring out when you can afford things. So, yeah. But the main reason I use Challenge Editor is for retry last round, because if I ever lose on a round, I can just press the retry last round button and figure out what I need to beat that round. The one issue with retry last round is that for some reason it resets the alk buff, so it can affect testing for RNG, which isn't always the nicest thing, but it's not too bad. And then I go into the game, obviously, and then the start, like the first 10, 15, sometimes even 20 rounds on most expert maps are pretty standard and just the same thing every time. Like the same dart monkey placements, stuff like that. You can just look that up for a map if you don't know it already. And if you're trying to do black border strategies, great place to look is an amazing YouTube channel I will link in the description, Spiffy. I stole his Churchill early game on Ravine, and steal more of his early games. They tend to be pretty good for expert maps. Usually, I only take the first bit, and then figure out the rest from there on my own. Exactly what I did in this one. I took his round 14 Geraldo from, I think, his anti-balloon video, and then I didn't look at the rest of his video and tried to figure out how the rest could work well. I ended up with an airburst sub and a Druid of the Jungle, which, pretty standard early game for Muddy Puddles, honestly. And for like pretty much any expert map that has water. Speaking of airburst subs and Druid of the Jungle, they're both really good early game towers, especially on expert maps. Airburst tends to be pretty good, and Druid of the Jungle is just amazing. Some other common early game towers are like double shot ninjas on certain maps. I think Sprocket engineers with pin tend to be like actually not too bad from what I remember. Bit expensive though, so you could just go for like a sentry with pin. I think those work. But for some more global things, everyone already knows that snipers are really good early game, and that Full Metal Jacket is a very common lead solution. And usually if you're running a hero on an expert map, it can probably see camo, so you shouldn't need too much camo detection for round 24. And you can actually start getting some at round 33. One of the biggest tips I can give for any player of this game is learn what comes on each round. It's very important to know that, because there are a bunch of rounds that sometimes might just catch you off guard, but if you knew what was in them, you would have known what to do there. Like round 71, super obscure round, but it's actually a fairly dangerous one due to the massive wave of grouped Moabs. Those are like pretty much all of the early game and mid-game tips I can give. Now we can transition to the late game tips, which honestly, it's so much can vary in the late game to the point where there's going to be a lot I have to say. Let's start off with late game support. Generally, I like to go for a Moab Glue just because it's really good. The slow is amazing, and sometimes if you want to save a bit of money, instead of getting like a glue splatter for your Moab Glue, you can get a primary training village, because you're probably already going to have a discount discounting your Moab Glue. Oh yeah, and speaking of discounts, those things are insane. You should always get at least one discount village. They can save you so much money, especially if you're working with super monkeys. Anyways, some more good late game support options tend to be Moab presses. We already know that. Call to arms can actually be pretty good if you're already getting the MIB for your main DPS tower if it can't pop DDTs. And it's only going to cost you an extra 21k for a pretty good buff. Honestly, call to arms is very worth it usually. If you're already getting a MIB, and yeah. Overclock is also usually a pretty decent buff. It works best in strategies where your main DPS is like a tier 4 tower, which is pretty much exclusively Dark Champion, because there isn't really another tier 4 strong enough to carry a run that would need an overclock. The only other tier 4 that can really carry a run is Tech Terror. So, and that doesn't need an overclock. And then, I don't know how I forgot to mention this so far, but Alk buffs. Get Alk buffs. Alk buffs tend to usually work better on towers that have a lot of projectiles, fast attack speed. So like pretty much just most towers. It works, Alk buff more specifically works really good with Bloon Solver and Bloon Incineration. It's very good with those two specifically, mostly because it buffs, I think it affects the glue puddles that the Solver drops, and it also affects the wall of fire that the Bloon Sin drops, and that's very, very good because that'll allow Bloon Sin to actually handle super ceramics, which is crazy. And more late game support options tend to be like ceramic stunners, stallers, so like a good stunner for towers that can't pop frozen bloons is like a Bloon Impact. Those tend to work really well if your tower can't pop frozen bloons. So, but if your tower can pop frozen bloons, I would more recommend a Snowstorm, and you can use the ability as a panic button, which I've done before. And if you want to get like a locked in place downdraft, because I don't think you're going to want to micro it in an expert black border. You definitely can, but you don't need to. You can like lock a downdraft in place. You can also get a spike factory for ceramic cleanup sometimes. Like a spiked balls, spiked mines if you got that mid-game. Does pretty well. Forgot to mention a very good one, but it's only good with certain strategies. Unstable Concoction tends to be very good. It creates a lot more insides, which means you need more pierce to handle it. So if your towers have high pierce and can deal with tons of insides like Bloon Solver, Concoction's gonna be pretty good because it'll just remove a ton of RBE for you. Embrittlement tends to be a pretty good support option late game too, with it possibly being able to act as a MIB skip on certain maps. If it's like, it can hit the DDTs and de-lead them, which helps out a lot, and it can also help with strategies that have low damage but a lot of projectiles, like Comanche Commander, or damage over time effects that work like the Bloon Solvers. Elite Sniper also tends to pair very well with Embrittlements. Just towers that deal low damage, have high attack speed, and have lots of projectiles tend to do very good with Embrittlements. And probably the most universal support option that I somehow forgot to mention so far is Sabo. Sabo can pretty much make DDTs from one of the scariest things in the game to fairly easy. Not all strategies need a Sabo for DDTs. If your strategy does enough damage to DDTs, you just won't need a Sabo. Like, Permacharge does good enough DDT damage. Archmage does enough DDT damage. If you get a mib for your elite sniper, it does good DDT damage. Stuff like that. Snowstorms also tend to be good versus DDTs, but they can also be used as a panic button. Another fairly good late game support that I've used a bit and I've seen a lot of other people use is Shattering Shells. Does exactly what it says, removes fortifications. Very good tower. Those are most of the good late game support options, I think, as long as I'm not forgetting any. Yeah, so now let's move on to round 100 damage. Some really good towers for around 100 damage are First Strikes, and there's a certain timing where after a little bit after the bad reaches its last damage phase, and you use a First Strike, it can wipe out the insides completely, but I'm guessing you already knew that. Some other good round 100 options are Spike Storms, those tend to be decent. Sticky Bomb is also fairly good value. Mob Assassins tend to be okay. Base Druids can be good if you have no money and just need a bit more damage. Yeah, those are really most of the good round 100 solutions. Also, probably my final tip here is try to look for synergies. It can help you out a lot. Try and look for towers that should do good together. If one tower is good at killing the ZOMG layer, and another tower is good at killing the ceramics from the inside, I don't know, Mob Eliminator, Bloon Solver, or something like that, I don't know. Good pairings like that. Or more normal synergies like Sada and Dragon Breath. When Sada hits level 11, I think it is, she deals extra damage to targets that have DOT on them, and Dragon's Breath can apply fairly consistent damage over time, so that'll make Sada deal a lot more damage. You know, small stuff like that. Also, this isn't intended to be a tutorial on how to make your own strategies for expert maps. This is more the process I use, but you can certainly use this as a tutorial on how to make strategies. The actual tutorial for how to make strategies will be in a while. And this background clip you see here will probably come out tomorrow, with commentary as a guide. Anyways, goodbye. See you next time.